With astonishing speed and skill, they checked their steeds, wheeled, and came charging round. Soon the three companions found themselves in a ring of horsemen, moving in a running circle up the hill slope behind them and down, round and round them, and drawing ever inwards. Aragorn stood silent, and the other two sat without moving, wondering what way things would turn. So, in words unchanged between the first draft and publication, the Riders of Rohan enter the Lord of the Rings. Soon their leader unlocks his word hoard, and we hear names Eomer, Riddermark, Theoden, and vocabulary Eored, Emnet, Merath, that signpost a cultural background more clearly than their war gear of chainmail, helms, and spears. To people who know the story, the people of Rohan seem ineradicably, indeed inevitably, Anglo-Saxon. Yet it was far from inevitable. Like Legolas, Tolkien had seen them coming from a long way off, but in important ways he was as short-sighted about them as Gimli. His plot notes show it wasn't until the very brink of their appearance that he identified them in any way with the Anglo-Saxons. That idea was a swerve or U-turn almost as swift and sudden as the riders' first galloping entrance. He conceived the horse kingdom of Rohan between August and early October 1939. He wrote Book 3, centred on Rohan, in 1942. After that, he could tell his son Christopher, with the voice of experience, that The Lord of the Rings seems to write itself once I get going, as if the truth comes out then, only imperfectly glimpsed in the preliminary sketch. But that retrospective certitude, that sense of revealed truth, may be partly or largely the net result of multiple creative decisions, collectively foreclosing any other outcome. Decisions that swing into place like the spears hemming in Aragorn and companions. Tom Shippey, the medievalist and veteran Tolkien expert who will appear several times in this talk, long ago pointed out one striking oddity about the people of Rohan. His groundbreaking 1984 book, The Road to Middle-earth, says, "The Rohirrim are nothing if not cavalry. By contrast, the Anglo-Saxons' reluctance to have anything militarily to do with horses is notorious. It lost them the Battle of Hastings against Norman bowmen and mounted knights, and so cost them their kingdom and culture too." Examining how Tolkien arrived at his idea of the inhabitants of Rohan is an education in his craft, in his creative rhythms, and in his underlying intentions for them. In particular, it helps to explain why he put them on horses. Towards the end of the Long Vac, in 1939, nearly 2 years after beginning The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien resumed work on his story for the first time in many months. The process of composition is laid out by Christopher, his son, in The Return of the Shadow, the 6th volume of his History of Middle-earth. In August, Tolkien found the time and energy to brainstorm various plot problems, and now dimly foresaw a few key plot points far ahead. Gollum returning from the Hobbit, Mordor, a fiery mountain erupting. And all this while Sauron and the free peoples of Middle-earth are engaged in open war, an idea he had not envisaged up till this point, when Europe itself was teetering on the brink of renewed war. Now he saw a few stepping stones towards those distant events in his plot. There were the misty mountains where the Company of the Ring would encounter a snowstorm in a pass. Under these peaks were the mines of Moria, which they would find infested with goblins. On the far side was a tributary by which they would reach the great river. Plenty of dramatic potential then, but why would the wise and resourceful Gandalf lead the company through such perils? Because the alternative must be at least as risky. This is where, in the published book, Aragorn tells the wizard, "Further south there are no passes till one comes to the Gap of Rohan. I do not trust that way since your news of Saruman. Who knows which side now the marshals of the Horse Lords serve?" However, neither Saruman nor Rohan had appeared in what Tolkien had written so far. It is clear, in fact, that he had not thought of them yet, and the first inkling of Saruman was still some way off. In this first 1939 draft, the warning words spoken by Gandalf are, "The passes further south are too far away and were guarded all years ago. They lead straight into the country of the beardless men," which Tolkien corrected to Mani Aroman, which he amended to horsemen. By further changes at the time of writing, the name Rohan made its debut. But before we get to that, I'm going to look at these first ideas one by one. I'm going to suggest that both the beardless men and Mani Aroman show Tolkien circling around a few ideas which the enigmatic horsemen would inherit and carry in their baggage until they rode into the story 2 years later as the Riders of Rohan. So, beardless men, eh? What was Tolkien thinking? Mountain passes guarded by moody, bum-fluff-chinned youngsters? You might call this a bingo moment. Not as in bingo, I've got it, but bingo Bulger Baggins, why on earth would you call your hero that? At the point we've reached in the story, Tolkien had only just changed the name to Frodo Baggins. So I scratched my head, and something in the phrase, "the country of beardless men," brought to mind the lands of women or dog-headed men or other bizarre inhabitants in the Wonders of the East stories widespread in medieval Europe. These were legends that sprang up around the historical journeys of Alexander the Great from Macedonia to India. The Old English Beowulf manuscript actually also includes a letter of Alexander to Aristotle and a version of Wonders of the East. Tolkien was partial to the tradition and developed from it his idea of the trees of the sun and moon in the Silmarillion. Still, beardlessness seems hardly a matter of curiosity and wonder. A dead end? Not entirely. Alexander led me to the stirringly titled Of Men and Beards, The Revealing History of Facial Hair by Christopher Oldstone Moore. It turns out that Alexander, always portrayed as clean-shaven, is further associated with beardlessness. The historian Plutarch wrote that he ordered his generals to have the beards of their Macedonians shaved, since these afforded the readiest hold in battle. So beardlessness is a proven martial asset among elite warriors. We're still a long way from the Riders of Rohan, yet beardlessness also points to another martial culture that Tolkien knew about. The North American warrior caused the hair to be plucked from his whole body. I should be doing this in an American accent, but I won't. I'll spare you that. A small tuft was left on the crown of his head in order that his enemy might avail himself of it in wrenching off the scalp in the event of his fall. This is James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha contrasts the white European incomers, this bearded people of the wooden vessel from the regions of the morning. As a child, Tolkien had loved so-called Red Indian stories, which made him long to shoot a bow and arrows. He certainly knew Hiawatha, and surely Fenimore Cooper's novels too. All this suggests there's real insight in Shippey's old observation that the Riders of Rohan behave like male-shirted Sioux or Cheyenne, with a streak of nomad ferocity. Still, apparently in the same moment that Tolkien first thought of a perilous land across the southern Misty Mountains, he abandoned the beardless men. Next, he wrote Mani Aroman. Perhaps one name or two, perhaps including false starts. This needs some thought and some background on Tolkien's naming practices at this point. His language schemes for The Lord of the Rings were far from fixed as yet. Mostly he had been inventing names in English. To suit a landscape with a history, he often used archaic forms such as Withywindle, Horwell, Trollshaws, with a smattering of anglicised Celtic around Bree, Archet, Chetwood, Coombe. Since reaching Elvish Rivendell, he had started making new names in Noldorin, one of the Elvish languages he had laboured over for more than 2 decades. From The Lord of the Rings, we know that as Sindarin, but at this point he called it Noldorin, and that's how I'll refer to it here. But he had decided this language was also used by the mortal descendants of the people of Numenor, his version of Atlantis. Tolkien had also invented a language for the dwarves, which would come into play in the next chapter, set in the abandoned dwarf city of Moria. Over the years, he had also created or sketched other languages we know little of, not all of them for Middle-earth, and at times, in the heat of composition, he would forget all about these possible languages and make up a name, simply because he liked the sounds. He might even borrow a name from history or literature, then change it later to something meaningful, or find a way to explain it in terms of one of his own invented languages. That's how he came up with Moria, stealing it from Soria Moria Castle, in a favourite Norwegian folktale for its sound, not its associations, but then re-etymologing it. You know what I mean. Figuring out a new etymology for it as Noldorin Moor, black, plus Ya, pit. Mani Aroman sounds like Quenya, another Elvish language, but it isn't readily interpretable as such. I think it was one of those names conjured in the heat of the moment when Tolkien was chiefly occupied with the unfolding plot. That's when unconscious associations are most likely to surface. Mani Aroman strikes a couple of highly appropriate chords in the real world. Aromanian is actually a name for a minority people of the Balkans and also their Latin-derived language, closely related to Romanian. They might well have interested Tolkien, who had a fondness for underdog peoples who, like the Finns up to 1917, didn't fit into national boundaries. The Aromanians have a history as nomadic shepherds around the Carpathians, so it's not hard to see a possible thought association with people who guard the passes of the Misty Mountains. Tolkien's Aroman also strikes a more familiar chord with Romani, Romani, or Roma, names for the Indo-Aryan travelling people known in English tradition as gypsies. The last surviving nomads in Western Europe, gypsies were socially and culturally much more prominent in the cultural and actual landscape during Tolkien's childhood and youth than they are now. They suffered prejudice and persecution, but also inspired imaginative romance, notably in George Borrow's 1850s novels Lavengro and the Romany Rye, which Tolkien knew. The Romany lifestyle was an act of living resistance against progress and uniformity, which Tolkien might have appreciated. They were horse traders and some were horse whisperers. In the 1930s, still, they were perennial visitors to the big horse races and trade events, present in great numbers, said the Times, at Bampton Fair in Oxfordshire. In 1936, when they converged from across Europe for their annual gathering in the Camargue, the Times Riviera correspondent wrote, "The scene on the night before the festival, when hundreds of campfires will be alight and the passionate music of the Hungarian and Spanish gypsies hold their hordes in ecstasy in its sheer simplicity, causes one to ponder whether these people have not more of the real joy of life than the millions whose very existence trembles upon the lips of a politician." In the era of the dictator, this correspondent somehow imagined the Romany were beyond the reach of people like Hitler. But in 1938, the newspaper reported that German authorities were arresting gypsies, the only other European race to be declared by the Nuremberg laws to be non-Aryan. That was just a couple of months before Tolkien, in his famous 1938 riposte to a German publisher's demand for proof of his Aryan ancestry, replied, "I am not of Aryan extraction, that is, Indo-Iranian. As far as I am aware, none of my ancestors spoke Hindustani, Persian, Gypsy, or any related dialects." Like the rest of his letter, the inclusion of Gypsy, out of a vast number of Indo-Iranian languages, was pointedly anti-Nazi. And the letter was just a year before Tolkien, thinking up names for the people south of the Misty Mountains, wrote Mani Aroman. It's a lot to hang on a couple of uninterpretable words. At any rate, the Romany idea was in the leaf mould of the European imagination, a people on the outside, proud, willful, in decline from a time when they could truly enjoy the freedom to roam and be themselves. All this and a love of horses too. Tolkien rejected Mani Aroman, perhaps recognising that its associations were too transparent, but the Romany idea seems to be in the leaf mould of The Lord of the Rings too. The gypsies of the 1930s might well be described in the same words Tolkien used much later for the Rohirrim, a still partly mobile and nomadic people of horse breeders. So it's a mere hoof step from here to what Tolkien now wrote in place of the beardless men and Mani Aroman, horsemen. But Tolkien had not finished. Immediately he rewrote Gandalf's words to give a name to this new country of horsemen that the company must avoid. It is no good whatever our trying to cross further south into the land of Thanador. It was the first of a quick burst of experimental forms, revolving around the idea of fealty. To interpret them, I used Tolkien's closely contemporary lexicon of Elvish roots and derivatives, the etymologies. In the Elvish language that he called at that time Noldorin, Thanador probably means land of the true, land of the stalwart. But then Tolkien added a prefix, ul, horrible, hideous, ul Thanador. What Gandalf says next throws some light on this jarring collocation. The Horse Kings have long been in the service of Sauron. So Ulthanador indicates that its people swear a horrible fealty. And yet a further replacement name swung back to the positive. Borthendor, land of the ever-true. On the face of it, the flipping of name meanings from positive to negative and back suggests that Tolkien's first thoughts about this people were in the balance. He could make them Sauron's allies or not, but there's always the possibility that he thought of them already, as in the final story, as trenchant enemies of the Dark Lord who are unjustly slandered. As we will see, the overall murkiness of the picture here accords with some very immediate issues at the time of writing in 1939, but perhaps a Romany idea persisted in the question mark hanging over the horse lords here. Gypsies have always existed on or across the borderline of laws designed for settled people, suffering prejudice and pogroms as a result. Finally, Tolkien hit upon the neutral name that would stick, Rohan. This is a name as real as Romany or Aromanian, belonging to a noble family prominent in French medieval history who claimed descent from the first kings of Brittany. He knew this, but rewrote its etymology, as he had done with Moria, to explain Rohan as Noldorin for horseland. Unlike the slightly earlier names, Rohan made it onto the map of the lands south of Rivendell that Tolkien sketched at this time. But the map also adds names for the people of that land. They are the Rohirroth, another Noldorin name, but also Anaxapians and Hippanaletians. These names are classical Greek. Like Rohirroth, Anaxapians means horse lords. Anyone who can properly explain Hippanaletians to me gets a prize of nothing but my gratitude. Christopher Tolkien finds these names surprising. Greek is not a language we've come to expect in the Legendarium, yet Tolkien would recall that before ever he became entranced by the North, he was brought up in the classics and first discovered the sensation of literary pleasure in Homer. And Tolkien much later described the people of Rohan as Homeric horsemen. The Greek names now on his sketch map show this too was a foundational idea in their creation. But Homer's world is sea-bound, and although the Iliad has horses aplenty, they pull chariots rather than serving as mounts. So what are Homeric horsemen? Homer associates several of the combatant peoples with horses and says the Phrygians fight from horses. He heaps the most lavish praise on the horses of the Thracians under King Rhesus. His are the finest horses I ever saw, and the biggest. They are whiter than snow, and their speed of foot is the wind's speed. They shine like the rays of the sun, terribly. In the words of editor David Monroe, in the edition Tolkien used at school, Rhys's horses are of more than mortal beauty. The Thracians were nomads who, like the Greeks, spoke an Indo-European language. Their homeland centred on what is now Bulgaria, from the Carpathian Mountains to the Black Sea. Thrace has some interesting connections in literature and history. Doubtless Tolkien knew that the Getae, a Thracian tribe, had long been claimed groundlessly as ancestors of the Germanic Goths who were so close to his heart. Perhaps it interested him that the Thracians neighboured Macedon, home of Alexander the Great and his father Philip, whose name means lover of horses. And maybe it's relevant that Thrace overlaps with the later stamping grounds of the Romance-speaking Aromanian nomads. But probably more important to Tolkien was this. To the Greeks, Thrace was the unknown and limitless north, whence blew the north wind Boreas, divine father of horses. In the Horsemen of Thrace, he would glimpse the ancient people of the north through the eyes of Homer. Besides that, philology traces the Homeric veneration of horses back to the Indo-European cultures of the ancient steppes, wide open spaces where the horse meant power. Back in the modern world, Tolkien had some experience with horses, military experience. As an undergraduate at Exeter College here in Oxford, he had been required to join King Edward's Horse, a territorial cavalry regiment. During the Battle of the Somme in 1916, he may occasionally have ridden among the other officers of the 11th Lancashire Fusiliers, his unit, such as when they encountered a British tank clanking its way up to the line and frightening the horses. He would also have known of the cavalry charges planned but stood down, or, at High Wood on the Somme, pursued to a futile and tragic end. All the more likely, then, that the timing of his idea of a land of horse lords is significant. Let's not forget that Tolkien had been constructing his legendarium since 1915. Despite his own experience of horses, he had never put horses in the forefront of his stories in all those 24 years, let alone a horse-centred culture. So why did that change? In Tolkien's creative processes, current affairs play a part surprisingly often. Since early 1939, fears of a German attack on Poland had reached fever pitch. In March, Britain and France pledged they would defend Poland if it were invaded. Tolkien had some personal interest, beside his hatred of Nazi aggression and his sympathy for small underdog nations. Family tradition held that his direct Tolkien forefather had fled Poland to England in the 18th century in the face of Prussian invasion. Suddenly, in 1939, British newspapers began enthusiastically hyping the gallant Poles and their defences. Poland was the world's fifth military power, declared a Times commentator, adding, "The outstanding feature of the Polish army is its cavalry. I should class it as the best in Europe. It is certainly the quietest. More than once, as I attended manoeuvres in eastern Galicia, I found myself surrounded by cavalry who had given no hint of their approach. I found the troops of excellent quality, trained to fight in small groups. Their initiative was keen." Feasibly, the ambiguous allegiance of Tolkien's horse lords, are they true? Are they false? Also reflects Poland's situation. From 1934 till now, fearing Soviet invasion from the east, the Poles had dallied with Hitler in a non-aggression pact. They had even exploited the German annexation of Czechoslovakia in 1938 to grab a piece of Czech territory for themselves. At any rate, the allure of a cavalry nation had months to soak into Tolkien's imagination during the build-up to war. It was in August that he picked up his story again and wrote numerous notes brainstorming problems and possibilities, and then he resumed actual writing, beginning at Rivendell and the first version of the Council of Elrond. By the time he got the Company of the Ring to the point where they opt not to risk the passes into Rohan, in the real world it must have been September. Germany had invaded Poland on the 1st, and now even more Polish gallantry filled the newspapers, all based on little more than rumour. Among the Polish cavalry charges reported to have happened was one against German tanks. As always in war, history shaded into myth, and in this instance it seems to have helped shape Tolkien's mythological history. To recap, Tolkien conceived the Horse Kingdom of Rohan between August and early October 1939. He left no description of the culture as he conceived it at this stage, only mentioning the country in a snatch of conversation in The Ring Goes South, and on the earliest map of the land south of Wilderland. Yet his quick-fire ideas for names for the country or its people point to several inspirations at the outset, from nomads both ancient and modern, both European and Native American, and from the terrible events unfolding simultaneously in Poland. Together, they would be enough for Tolkien to begin forming these ideas: a semi-nomadic people of grassland and mountain valley, breeders of horses of a divine bloodline, a cavalry beyond compare for agility, speed and courage, but all overshadowed either by a misplaced allegiance to a common enemy or by false reports. This was not theft, but synthesis, at which he was superbly skilled. In the process, he hit the mark somewhere between the archetypal and the unique. The air of originality is hugely enhanced by the way he seamlessly wove it all into his larger creation, Middle-earth, its vast matrix of history, geography and language. If he had stuck with calling the Horse Lords Anaxipians, their Homeric inspiration would have been relatively clear: a Made in Ancient Greece label, like the Made in England label that sticks to the Bagginses and Brandybucks and Bracegirdles of the Shire. By calling the Horse Lords and their country by elvish names, Rohirroth or Rohirrim, Rohan, he marked them instead as Made in Middle-earth. And this is evidently what he intended for them from their conception in 1939 until early 1942, just before they rode in across the grassland to meet Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli. Further work on the Council of Elrond in 1941 introduces the name Riddermark for Rohan. This is a modernised form of Old English Ridenamerk. Yet there is no sign that Tolkien had now decided to make the Horse Lords themselves quasi-Anglo-Saxons. Rather, I suggest, it belongs at this point with other archaic English names that Tolkien used broadly to indicate old names in an archaic form of the common speech used by people in general. The Council discussions give a hint of why the Horse Lords and their land would have Noldorin names. Remember I said that the survivors of Numenor Atlantis had spoken Noldorin. We now learn that Rohan occupies a former part of Ondor, the land once settled by Numenorians. Gondor in the published version, obviously. The inference must be that the Horse Lords adopted the language of their more powerful neighbours, but there are indications that the horses of Rohan originally came from Numenor too, giving them a touch of special nobility or even blessedness. This 1941 work on the Council of Elrond also momentously introduced Sauron, the renegade wizard. Now he became the reason the Company of the Ring crosses the Misty Mountains further north. At a stroke, the Horse Lords lost the job for which they were originally invented. But at the same time, Tolkien found another excellent use for them, providing Gandalf, after escape from Saruman, with a truly worthy horse. Gandalf says nothing about his visit to Rohan. Tolkien had not yet given it any thought, but says of his new steed, "He is a grey horse and was named Halbarad, but I have called him Greyfax," which Tolkien changed to Shadowfax. This tiny detail, so easily overlooked among the plethora of transient names and ideas, is the clearest confirmation that Tolkien did not yet envisage the Horse Lords of Rohan as Anglo-Saxon in language and culture. The name Shadowfax meaning shadow mane, is a modernised form of Old English shadu plus fax. In the published Lord of the Rings, it is the horse's name in Rohan. But here Shadowfax is the name Gandalf gives the horse, which in Rohan is called Halbarad, a name perfectly Noldorin in sound and shape. That's distracting that in the published work, Halbarad is the name of a ranger, kinsman of Aragorn. Tolkien sometimes liked the shape and sound of a name so much that he would try it on different people or horses. In these early stages of composition, even Aragorn first appears as the name of a horse. As the name of a ranger, Halbarad might mean tall tower. He is first introduced as tall, a dark standing shadow. But tall tower doesn't seem suitable for a beast, except possibly a giraffe or elephant. I suspect that as a horse name, Halbarad has nothing to do with tallness or towers. There is a Noldorin word hal, veiled, hidden, shadowed, shady. So it probably refers to the horse's colour as Shadowfax does. The one certainty is that it is not Old English. Therefore, Tolkien did not yet imagine using Old English for the Horse Lords of Rohan. What happened between this point and the arrival of Éomer and his Ered of riders out of the Emnet of Rohan? Let's turn to Professor Shippey again and a lecture he delivered at the Bodleian Library to accompany the marvellous 2018 Tolkien exhibition there. It's online if you want it, from the horse's mouth. Sorry. Believe me, I cut out a lot of gags. Shippey believes that Tolkien had created a problem for himself when, writing The Hobbit simply to entertain his children, he had casually lifted the dwarves' names from a medieval list of dwarfs in the Old Norse mythological Poetic Edda. Why hadn't he given the dwarves names in their own language? This is a problem which would not have bothered 999 authors of fantasy out of 1,000, says Shippey, and I reckon that's a severe underestimate. But as the Lord of the Rings grew, it seemed to Tolkien to demand much more philological rigour. And his solution appears in an isolated manuscript memo about languages. The language of the Shire equals modern English. The language of Dale equals Norse, used by the dwarves of that region. The language of Rohan equals Old English. Modern English is a lingua franca spoken by all peoples, except a few secluded folk like Lorien. In other words, these real languages could represent the fictional ones, and crucially, since those real languages were interrelated in specific ways, this would indicate how the fictional ones related to each other too. Already Tolkien had used Old Norse for the dwarves and Modern English for the hobbits. In reality, these are both offshoots of a Germanic tree of languages. Think of them as not-so-distant cousins. So, in The Lord of the Rings, this would also be how hobbit speak was related to Dale speak. A rationale for what had been haphazard in The Hobbit. It meant Tolkien could also extend the rudimentary fictional language tree with a branch represented by Old English. It was an elegant philological masterstroke. Shippey calls the memo about languages Tolkien's turning point, because it meant he could now start using his professional knowledge to reconstruct in great depth imaginary ancient cultures, and in particular a kind of idealized Anglo-Saxondom, the Riders of Rohan. I think Shippey is roughly right about what happened, but I cavil on several points. He's tough as he is estimable, so I'm sure he'll take it on the chin. One problem is the notion that Old English had no systematic place in The Lord of the Rings before it reaches Rohan. It's true that Old English names are much rarer, earlier, Gollum's real name, Smeargol, a place to creep into. Entish Dales or Entish lands, containing the Old English word for giant, for the troll-haunted region north of Rivendell. But there is evidence that, in fact, before Tolkien assigned Old English to Rohan, he tried it out on another culture. This is easy to overlook because it involves a bewildering forest of name changes. The ranger at Bree, at this point known to the hobbits as Trotter rather than Strider, had been named Aragorn since 1939, when Tolkien first decided he was not a hobbit himself but a man of Númenórean ancestry. But while working on the Lothlórien episode, Tolkien decided he must have a name in the common speech represented by English rather than Gnome Elvish, Noldorin. So at this point in the manuscripts, Aragorn is replaced by Elfstone, son of Elfhelm. There's a brief detour where he is Ingold, son of Ingrim. Tolkien also auditioned and rejected other Old English names for Trotter, including modernised forms Erkenbrand, Elfmere, and Elfwold. Christopher Tolkien makes no surmise about the underlying rationale for ditching Aragorn, but it seems clear that at Lothlórien, Tolkien determined that the Rangers of the North used names in an archaic form of the common speech. The common speech is represented by modern English, so this archaic form would be Old English. The idea made sense of Old English elements in place names such as the Entish Dales. There's no evidence that he imagined the Rangers currently speaking Old English, but that may simply be because we never see them speaking among themselves at this stage in the manuscripts. So it's feasible. At any rate, whatever value accrued from an association with Old English, the Rangers would have it to some extent or another. The concept coexisted with the idea that the men of Rohan spoke Noldorin, borrowed from their near neighbours in Ondor, the southern Númenórean realm. However, it wasn't long before Tolkien abandoned the idea of quasi-Anglo-Saxons in the north and reinstated the name Aragorn for Trotter. In the draft of The Departure of Boromir, dying Boromir bids him farewell by his Old English name, Elfstone. At the end of that chapter, Christopher says, Tolkien had no thought of halting and continued straight on into the Riders of Rohan, where, after an unfortunate lacuna in the draft manuscript, he is Aragorn again. And in the fair copy of The Departure of Boromir, dying Boromir's words are farewell Aragorn. So at this point, Tolkien had clearly abandoned the idea of making the Rangers of the North use Old English names systematically. Another problem with Shippey's analysis is chronology. When did Tolkien solve his philological problem by deciding the language of Rohan was Old English? On this question, Shippey paints with a broad brush. He says it was just after Moria, when Tolkien had to start inventing places not in The Hobbit. He also says that the all-important memo occurs at the end of the chapter titled Treebeard. But that's 9 long chapters later, and writing them took Tolkien anything from 2 to 15 months. And although it's true that the memo is published after Treebeard in The Treason of Isengard, Christopher Tolkien's book about this section of The Lord of the Rings, that's not where it appears in the manuscripts. It's simply one of several notes on various topics, heterogeneous and not necessarily of the same time, that Christopher gathers here for convenience. So a fog hangs over when Tolkien had his language brainwave? No. It's clear to me that the memo about languages is intimately linked with an item published elsewhere in The Treason of Isengard, where we meet our friend Halbarad the Horse again. We leap forward from the Council of Elrond or Moria, both in 1941 to just after the departure of Boromir, written on or soon after the 19th of January 1942, as I've demonstrated in a previous talk at Marquette University. Before starting the next chapter, The Riders of Rohan, Tolkien wrote an outline of what was to come. It's worth mentioning that the only Rohan-related name in this outline is the Noldorin Rohirroth, Horse Lords. On the same page as this outline, he wrote a numbered list of points. Note number 1 mentions Greyfax, amended to Shadowfax, Halbarad. This Noldorin horse name fits with note 2. The Rohirroth are relations of the Woodmen of Mirkwood and Bearnings, old men of the north. Not old men of the north, old men of the north. But they speak Gnomish, the tongue of Numenor and Ondor, as well as the common tongue. It was at this very point, I suggest, that Tolkien had his epiphany, his eureka moment, and turned aside to write his all-important memo about languages. The name Bearn, used in The Hobbit, is Old English, and Bearnings is from Old English Bearningas, people of Bearn. As relatives of the Bearnings, the Horse Lords should surely speak the same language as them. Hence, the language of Rohan equals Old English. Returning, as I think, to his numbered list, Tolkien took all this on board. The remaining notes, 3, 4 and 5, mention first Eomer, then various names such as Marhad and Marhath for the second master, then Eowyn Elfsheen, daughter of Eamund. All these names are Old English, with Elfsheen modernised from Alfshuna, Elven Beautiful. Chronologically, this is the real turning point, a radically new plan for the Horse Lord's language that Tolkien immediately put into action. The chapter, The Riders of Rohan, introduces Eomer and mentions Marhath, and features Old English terms such as Eored, troop. As we know, it was a stroke of genius. Yes, he had used Old English names in other areas of the widening world of The Lord of the Rings, but these had begun to form a significant cluster around Rohan: Riddermark, Wetwang, Ent, Orthanc, Saruman. For the culture Tolkien was now introducing, he had a rich and ready language to hand, one that carried associations from a true ancient literature familiar to many readers. This was all part and parcel of his professional work here, as Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon. But it may be significant that in Hilary Term 1942, which began just as he began Book 3, on the 19th of January 1942, he was lecturing undergraduates on Old English verse, metre, style, and diction. When Tolkien brought the story to Edoras, seat of the king, he was able to pay rich homage to Beowulf in the way the travellers are welcomed or not, in the description of the great hall Meduseld, and in the presence of an ill-willed counsellor. Tolkien could draw on Old English poetry by importing lines from the elegiac Wanderer into a song of Rohan, Where now the horse and the rider? Orthanc and Ent appear together in one line from the Anglo-Saxon Maxims 2, Orthanc enter your work, the cunning work of giants, a reference to the Roman relics in southern Britain, which seemed so vast and inexplicable to the incoming Anglo-Saxons. Somewhere in the initial idea of calling Eowyn Elfsheen may be found the kernel of her encounter with the chief of the Nazgul on his flying beast, because this Old English adjective is also used of the Old Testament Judith, slayer of the Assyrian general Holofernes. She decapitates him. I want to finish by returning to the impact of current events. This may seem perverse. After all, when in January 1942 the story entered Rohan, Tolkien plunged into a revivification of an ancient culture. But it was a Germanic culture he was reviving, and he revered Germanic culture but loathed what modern history was making of it. Back in June the previous year, he had written, I have spent most of my life since I was your age, he's writing to his son Michael, studying Germanic matters in the general sense that includes England and Scandinavia. There is a great deal more force and truth than ignorant people imagine in the Germanic ideal. I was much attracted by it as an undergraduate when Hitler was, I suppose, dabbling in paint and had not heard of it. You have to understand the good in things to detect the real evil. But no one ever calls on me to broadcast or do a postscript. Yet I suppose I know better than most what is the truth about this Nordic nonsense. Anyway, I have in this war a burning private grudge, which would probably make me a better soldier at 49 than I was at 22, against that ruddy little ignoramus Adolf Hitler. For the odd thing about demonic inspiration and impetus is that it in no way enhances the purely intellectual stature. It chiefly affects the mere will. Ruining, perverting, misapplying, and making forever a curse to that noble northern spirit, a supreme contribution to Europe, which I have ever loved and tried to present in its true light. Nowhere, incidentally, was it nobler than in England. In Rohan, then, he created a noble Anglo-Saxondom that, after internal moral crisis, throws off the temptations and whisperings of a sinister allegiance and stands tall in the saddle. When January 1942 came round, at the very point when he decided to create his revived Germanic culture in Rohan, there was a further reason, patriotic and anxious, to depict a noble English nation of this sort. In December, Japan had joined the war with surprise attacks on Pearl Harbor and on British-held Malaysia. In January, the Japanese were still moving through Malaysia, while British troops fought a long series of losing skirmishes. On the 19th of January, newspaper headlines declared that the Japanese had crossed the Muar River, the penultimate geographical barrier before Singapore, Britain's so-called fortress in the Far East. Tolkien was part of a nation fighting a war that he believed was necessary. And as 1942 came in, it seemed a nation with its back against the wall. He was not a fan of empire, British or otherwise, but in the wider picture of war, the imminent fall of Singapore could only seem like an axe blow. On the 19th of January, Tolkien doodled phrases from news headlines, including Muar River, on a sheet which he also used to unfold an unforeseen plot for the upcoming chapters of The Lord of the Rings. It began with the breaking of the Fellowship, an event that Tolkien had long had in mind because he knew Frodo and Sam would be splitting off towards Mordor on their own. But his ideas about the rest of the Fellowship had been vague indeed. Boromir and Aragorn going off to Minas Tirith, Merry and Pippin simply getting lost and meeting the Ents, Legolas and Gimli giving up and going home. Suddenly, with this news of a momentous river crossing in Malaysia, the picture fell into place. Orcs would cross the River Anduin for the first time, capture Merry and Pippin, and carry them off across Rohan towards Saruman in Isengard, with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli in hot pursuit. It opened up a vast opportunity for involving the Horse Lords, Germanic but not corrupt, English but not imperial. Around the 9th of February, Tolkien brought The Lord of the Rings to the reappearance of Gandalf in Fangorn Forest, or perhaps as far as his arrival at Edoras. However long it had taken Tolkien to get from Rivendell to the borders of Rohan, he was galloping now. Thank you.